예쁘지 않아? 안 예쁘다고? 잠깐만. 자, 어때? Today I'll explain how to make your sentences negative. Not that kind of negative. That's what I mean. There are two ways to make your sentences negative. One way is with 지않다, and the other way is using 안. If you can use both of them, 안 sounds a bit more informal than 지않다, but they both have the same meaning. I'll show you how to use each of them. 지않다 is used by taking the verb stem, which is taking the verb and removing the da, and then adding 지않다, then conjugating it. It's simple, quick, and will always be correct. Here are some examples. 저는 한국말을 자주 공부하지 않아요. I don't study Korean often. If you're wondering about how to conjugate 지않다, check out episode 2 on conjugation. 날씨가 좋지 않습니다. The weather is not good. 그렇게 나쁘지 않아. It's not that bad. You can also use 지않다 when asking questions. In this way, it has the feeling of don't you or aren't you. In English, you have to rearrange words when asking questions like this, but in Korean, it stays the same. 김치를 좋아하지 않아요? Don't you like kimchi? 그 여자를 사랑하지 않아? Don't you love her? I should also add that sometimes you might see other particles attached between 지 and 않다, such as 도, 는, or 가, for example. Here's an example of what I mean. 그는 학교에 가지도 않아요. He doesn't even go to school. This is perfectly normal, and once you feel confident with how to use these particles by themselves, feel free to add them to your sentences whenever you want. The other way to make negative sentences is by just putting 안 before the verb. Here are some examples of this. 나는 안 심심해. I am not bored. 학교에 안 가? Don't you go to school? Or aren't you going to school? 그거 안 먹어? Aren't you going to eat that? Notice that this sentence is informal because it's missing the object marker after 그거, and it doesn't end in a 요. Adding 안 works with many verbs, but not with every verb. If you're not sure if you can attach 안 to the verb, just use 지않다 instead. However, if you want to know exactly what verbs are okay, I need to give you some background information on the Korean language. If you're just starting to learn Korean and are new, you might want to skip this part of the video. Okay, here we go. About 60% of the Korean language comes straight from the Chinese language. Before Hangul was created, there was no way to write Korean. Instead, people who could read and write simply learned Chinese. Chinese characters were read with Korean pronunciation, and those words evolved into what we have today. A quick example where you can see this is the Korean number system. Korea has two number systems, one of them starting with 1, 2, 3, and the other with 하나, 둘, 셋. I'm sure you've heard this before. 하나, 둘, 셋 are pure Korean words and didn't come from Chinese. But 1, 2, 3 came from Chinese characters and are called Sino-Korean. Sino meaning China. Anyway, so why is that important? Because if you know whether the verb is pure Korean or Sino-Korean, you can know whether you can use an with the verb to make it negative, or if you have to use 지않다. For all pure Korean verbs, you can use either an before the verb or 지않다 at the end. And for all Sino-Korean verbs, you can only use 지않다. Let's take the verb 심심하다. This means to be bored, and is considered to be a pure Korean word. Because it's a pure Korean word, you can either use an in front of it, 안 심심하다, to not be bored, or 지않다 after it, 심심하지 않다, which also means to not be bored. Now let's look at 공부하다. This is to study, and is a Sino-Korean verb. Because it's Sino-Korean, we can't use an before it, so we can only make it negative by adding 지않다 at the end. 공부하지 않다, which means to not study. There's also an exception to these rules. Some Sino-Korean verbs with only one character followed by 하다 can also use 안 or 지않다. For example, 정하다 or 통하다 are Sino-Korean, but you can make them negative by adding 안 before or 지않다 afterward. However, 원하다, to want, does not work. Tricky? Yeah, I know. It'll take some time before you get used to knowing which verbs are okay to use 안 with, but hopefully this bit of background will help make that simpler. The main rule to remember is this. If you're not sure whether you can use 안 or 지않다, just use 지않다 and you'll be safe all the time. 다음에 또 봐!